The idea that a cap could be put on the carbon price and Australia and the world accept the amount of mitigation that happens to come from that is inconsistent with the urgency of the emissions reduction task. The work of the review on the reality of the rate of growth in emissions in the platinum age has led to realisation that the time available for effective action is considerably shorter than previously assessed. Warwick's own work, adopting different methods, has arrived at a position on business as usual emissions that is as similar to ours as we both are different from the early conventional wisdom. There is indeed need and room for flexibility in the emissions trading scheme system to take account of any current misjudgments in the future costs of mitigation, fluctuations over time in economic variables affecting the permit price, and the shocks that from time to time enter any market. These were discussed in the interim report, and that discussion will be taken further in the draft report. This comes from opportunities for international trade in permits, from opportunities for hoarding and lending permits, and from occasional discretionary interventions by the regulator, the Independent Carbon Bank. The closest analogue of the independent regulator is the Reserve Bank of Australia and its interventions in the foreign exchange market. Nor does the logic of analysis of decisions under uncertainty in the presence of risk aversion argue for delay and slow starts on mitigation while we gather more information. Uncertainty, the possibility of extreme outcomes, and risk aversion point towards firm action to keep options alive, while the advance of science narrows the range of uncertainty. An ETS with a price cap does not allow, and Warwick does not support, large-scale trade in permits. Such trade can substantially reduce the costs of specified levels of mitigation in Australia and in the world as a whole. It is an essential condition for substantial mitigation effort in many developing countries, certainly including our neighbours, Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. I've learned much from Warwick's work on climate change over the past decade and more. Some parts of his contribution have continuing relevance. His model is one of 3 being applied in the joint Garnaut Review Treasury work that is now in progress. But regrettably, large parts of Warwick's blueprint are not the best fit in the world of international climate change in 2008. There's been a lot of public interest in the timing of the modelling work that the Garnaut Review is undertaking with the Treasury. I said in Sydney in a speech to a coal conference a month ago that the main modelling results would come out in a supplementary draft report in late August. The modelling has taken longer than we had originally hoped, entirely as a result of the complexity of the task of integrating the use of 3 general equilibrium models and their application to an exercise of unprecedented ambition, involving, amongst others, the projection of developments in the Australian and global economy over a century. Mitigation costs under a range of emissions reduction scenarios are being analysed. None of the scenarios has led to the overwhelming of the models, despite what you might have read in the newspapers. So that's the costs of mitigation. We've got to balance that in making our big policy decisions against 4 kinds of benefits from mitigation. 3 kinds of benefits from climate change mitigation can be measured in monetary values as a change in the value of output or consumption. Assessing welfare that is affected by the 4th, in addition to the first 3 kinds of benefit of mitigation, requires a different measurement unit. Let us evoke an old tradition in economics and talk about units of utility. The first kind of benefit comprises currently measurable market impacts. The measurement can be brought together through a computable general equilibrium economic model. The second kind of benefit comprises market impacts that are similar in nature to the first, but which are not amenable to precise measurement in the current state of knowledge. For the review, these comprise impacts that were not defined precisely enough in time for the review's modelling, which are, in principle, amenable to quantitative analysis. Examples of this second category from the review include increased demands for defence expenditure in response to geostrategic instability associated with climate change, or the impact of climate change on the tourism or wine industries. As with the first type of benefits, the estimation of these effects will be in monetary values of GDP or consumption. The third kind of mitigation benefit is the insurance value that it provides. On many impacts, there is large asymmetry between human evaluation of outcomes that are much more benign and much more damaging than the mean. Some of the possible outcomes near the more damaging end of the probability distribution would be thought by many people to be catastrophic. In such cases, mitigation has additional insurance value. What would we be prepared to pay to avoid a small probability of a highly damaging or possibly catastrophic outcome? It may be more than we would be prepared to pay to avoid the certain prospect of the mean outcome. Like the first and second kinds of benefit from mitigation, insurance value of mitigation can be measured in monetary value of GDP or consumption, at least to the extent that you're insuring monetary values. The possibility of outcomes that most people will consider to be catastrophic makes this a particularly important element of the assessment. Weitzman sees it as the main element, and I'll quote from an important paper of Weitzman's. The burden of proof in the economics of climate change is presumptively upon whomever wants to model optimal expected utility growth under endogenous greenhouse warming without having structural uncertainty tending to matter much more than risk. Such a middle-of-the-distribution modeller needs to explain why the inescapably thick tails of the distribution is not the primary focus of attention and does not play the decisive role in analysis. And the fourth category is non-market benefits that Australian recognise as contributing to utility, but which don't provide their benefit through market processes and are not manifested in conventional consumption of goods and services. We can think of a utility function as rising with Australian consumptions of goods and services, and also with a number of non-monetary services, such as environmental amenity, longevity, health and welfare of people in other countries. If the comparisons of costs and benefits of mitigation suggest a particular outcome, and it is clear from inspection that inclusion of the fourth, the non-monetary values, might lead elsewhere, it is necessary explicitly to compare the monetary with the non-monetary effects on welfare. Examples of such non-market impacts include Australians' valuation of environmental amenity, the Great Barrier Reef and other features of the Australian and international landscapes, inherited shorelines, genetic diversity and the survival of species, or the use of green urban gardens and playing fields for recreation. Non-market elements in a utility function and the level of utility when the function includes market and non-market elements are in their natures difficult to measure. Any mitigation policy decisions will implicitly value them alongside changes that can be measured more easily. We are taking a decision on those values whether or not we are explicit in the assessment. Traditional welfare economics contains a few important insights into the roles that non-market factors such as environmental amenity and concern for the welfare of others might play in determining utility in a world of climate change and of possibilities of mitigation. The non-market values are likely to be superior goods in that the relative value that people assign to them rises with incomes. In the late 21st century, when the average purchasing power of incomes over material goods and services is likely to be several times the present level, much higher relative value will be placed on any truncation of the natural estate that has occurred in the intervening years. It is likely that at higher incomes, the price elasticity of substitution between conventional consumption and access to such non-market values as environmental amenity and concern for others will be low and much lower than today. Near subsistence levels of consumption, few people would willingly sacrifice much access to material goods and services for greater environmental amenity or for improved development prospects of others at home or abroad. But in the likely material affluence of the late 21st century, many more people are likely to want to trade substantial amounts of access to material consumption for improved values of services that are not available through market processes. An extremely low rate of substitution between non-market services and conventional consumption of goods and services at high incomes would challenge the proposition that continuing economic growth would necessarily lead to higher average utility in the distant future. One implication of these insights is that the utility to Australians under policies that allocate high priority to such non-market values as the services provided by the natural environment is likely to be much higher than the application of today's preference systems would suggest. Now, measuring the benefits of mitigation against the cost. To a sceptical economist like me, not a dissenter, the case for action is not made simply by comparing the cost of unmitigated climate change with the cost of mitigation. The relevant comparator is the reduction in the cost of climate change that is achieved as a result of the mitigation action. They're not the same things. If we are evaluating Australian mitigation action, the reduction in costs of climate change that is relevant is that associated with the total global mitigation action that it enables, either by Australia or by the set of countries which are undertaking joint action. The benefit from mitigation is the costs of climate change avoided. Do the benefits of mitigation exceed the costs for Australians? The costs of mitigation come earlier and are more certain. The benefits come later and are less certain. How do we compare later with earlier benefits? How do we compare more with less certain outcomes? Here we must come to grips with challenging issues about discounting for time and about the conversion of probability distributions into expected values, and of comparing the value of a certain outcome with an uncertain distribution of outcomes with the same mean. The costs and benefits of mitigation in Australia and in other countries fall on and accrue to different groups of people in the community, so the distribution of the burden of mitigation becomes an important element in the overall assessment of the optimal degree of mitigation. The Stern report in Britain addressed the question of whether mitigation action was justified for the world as a whole. That turns out to be an easier question than whether mitigation action is justified from the point of view of an individual country. An assessment of whether mitigation action is justified for an individual country must deal with all of the complexities that Stern addressed for the world as a whole, plus one. And the additional source of complexity is perhaps the most difficult of all. The relevant mitigation is global. A single country's action is relevant only in its direct and indirect contribution to global mitigation. The review's terms of reference require it to analyse the degree of Australian mitigation effort that would be necessary to support a global agreement to hold greenhouse gas concentrations to 550 parts per million and separately to 450 parts per million. The final report, with the support of the modelling reported in detail in the draft supplementary report, will examine the choice of Australian mitigation ambitions comprehensively. Should society place any limit on the future time over which it remains concerned for the utility of Australians? It is not obvious why we should do so. The value of avoided and of irreversible effects of climate change extends forward to the point at which the life of the human species would have been extinguished by some separate influence. So if we are to include the welfare of all future generations in our assessment of utility, how should we value the future relative to the present? In comparing utility across generations, we need to determine the discount rate. There are two key variables: the pure rate of time preference and the elasticity of the marginal utility of consumption. The rate of pure time preference is the rate at which future utility is discounted simply because it is in the future. Many of the philosopher kings of economics, from Ramsay to Sen, have argued for a pure rate of time preference that is close to zero. This approach was followed by Stern, who placed it at 0.1%, corresponding to a view on the probability in any year of human extinction. Some have commented that if the probability of extinction were as high as that, it is unlikely that the human species would be here. Stern might respond that the human capacity to construct truly fateful weapons of mass destruction has not been with us for long. There is another view. The market discount rates reflect the time preferences that are revealed in actual decisions on savings and investment, which are the vehicles for arbitrage between future and current economic activity. This was the main criticism of Stern's approach. The issue is whether the pure rate of time preference is a normative or a positive issue. Should we think about this question in terms of what people actually do, reflected in market interest rates, or what they should do? The second determinant of the discount rate is the marginal elasticity of utility with respect to consumption. This is a measure of society's concern for equity and income distribution. We accept that $1 of incremental income means less to the utility of the poor than of the rich. How much less? Higher and lower values have been suggested, but no one contests that income has diminishing marginal utility with increased income. In the expected circumstances of continually rising incomes over the next century, this argues for placing higher value on current than future income. This argument for being careful about the sacrifice of current utility through expenditure on mitigation in pursuit of future income is a powerful one. It will be the more powerful if a substantial part of the burden of current mitigation were to be placed on people in low-income countries, to the extent that their prospects for economic development were to be significantly diminished. There is one qualification of this case for caution about strong mitigation on intergenerational income distribution grounds. To the extent that there is a low rate of substitution between conventional consumption and non-market services when incomes are high, and to the extent that climate change introduces a possibility that the availability of non-market services may be greatly diminished for future generations, one cannot be sure that, despite much higher material consumption, the average utility of people in future will be greater than the average utility today. If anything like a market discount were used, developments over the time periods that are necessary for mitigation policy to have a substantial effect do not matter much at all. At a real discount rate of 4%, the rate that the Garnaut Review has judged to be appropriate for modelling the future price curve for emissions permits, and that's a different issue, different problem, $1 in 50 years' time is worth just 14 cents today. At market rates for equities and other assets that are judged to be risky, the value of incremental income or consumption in half a century is negligible. Are we at all comfortable about living for the moment to the extent suggested by the use of market rates? Is there tension between our normative, what should be done, and positive, what seems to happen in markets, a view of discounting for the future? Should we treat the interest rates generated in financial markets as market failures? The application of a social discount rate lower than market rates is recommended as best practice in one highly practical area of applied policy-oriented economics, cost-benefit analysis. Little and Murley's recommend the application of a lower rate of discount for future incomes than is generated in financial markets. If there is market failure in debt markets, it has two elements. These work in opposite directions in the conventional case where average incomes and utility rise over time. The market's myopia might be expected to price in a significant rate of pure time preference. On the other hand, the preference of the poor are underrepresented in financial markets and the future of the future poor not represented at all. My own inclination is towards the use of a low pure rate of time preference, alongside recognition that in dealing with the means of the probability distributions, future income should be valued at substantially less per dollar on intergenerational equity grounds. The net result may justify the application of something like a market rate of interest for good sovereign debt to the discounting of outcomes near the middle of the distributions from the mainstream science. The final report will seek to present sensitivity of the policy conclusions to variations of the discount rate so that you'll be able to form your own assessment of how things would have been different at different interest rates. That's all when we're talking about the means of the probability distributions. A different calculus becomes necessary for consideration of the future values of the truly awful possibilities. The review successively in the draft report, the supplementary draft report and the final report will present quantitative measures where it can and estimate the potentially measurable effects when the data are not available for elaborate modelling of the potentially measurable. The draft report on July 4 and the final report will discuss the implications of taking into account the possibility of outcomes being much worse than is suggested by the means of the probability distributions. They will seek to bring to account the value of various non-market services that are valued by Australians and which will be substantially affected by realisation of outcomes predicted by mainstream science. Doing all of these things in a transparent way will, I hope, reveal to the governments to which I will be reporting and to the Australian community the implications of the climate change policy choices that will be made over the period ahead. An observation of daily debate and media discussion in Australia would lead one to the view that this issue is too hard for rational policy making in Australia. The issues are too complex. The vested interests surrounding are too numerous and intense. the relevant timeframes too long. Following the Lee lecture last year, climate change policy remains a diabolical problem. That's how I described it in my first public lecture on the subject. There is a chance, just a chance, that Australia and the world will manage to develop a position that strikes a good balance between the costs of dangerous climate change and the costs of mitigation. The consequences of the choice are large enough for it to be worth a large effort to take that chance in the short period that remains before our options diminish fatefully. Thank you.